On May 27, 1940, the weather killed an army. A sudden North Sea gale, unseasonable and savage, swept across the English Channel that morning, grounding every fighter aircraft in RAF Coastal Command and scattering the civilian boats that Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay had been assembling for Operation Dynamo. The little ships, the pleasure craft and fishing vessels and river ferries that would become legend, never reached Dunkirk. Most turned back to English harbours. Dozens sank in the churning waters off Dover, and in the skies above the trapped British Expeditionary Force, there was nothing but German aircraft. The Luftwaffe flew from inland airfields beyond the storm's reach. Hermann Göring, who had promised Hitler that his air force alone could destroy the pocket, finally had his chance to prove it. Without RAF opposition, German bombers methodically demolished the harbour moles, the concrete breakwaters that were the only structures capable of loading troops onto larger vessels. By nightfall, Dunkirk's port facilities had ceased to exist. The destroyers that might have carried thousands to safety instead burned at their moorings or listed in the shallow waters off the beach. But what no one in London yet understood, what would only become clear in the terrible days ahead, was that this storm had done more than delay an evacuation. It had closed a window that would never reopen. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The British Expeditionary Force numbered approximately 338,000 men. They had been fighting a rearguard action since the German breakthrough at Sedan 2 weeks earlier, falling back toward the coast as the panzers swept around them. Hitler's controversial halt order had given them precious days to establish a defensive perimeter along the canal lines south of Dunkirk. They had used that time well, but perimeters require supply, and supply requires evacuation routes, and now those routes existed only as burning wreckage in a harbour choked with debris. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for exactly 17 days. The German assault resumed at dawn on May 28th. Without air cover, the canal line became a killing ground. British and French troops who had held their positions through 5 days of fighting now faced dive bombers operating with impunity, their screaming Stukas pinpointing every strongpoint and artillery position. Ammunition stocks that might have lasted another week evaporated in hours of continuous combat. By noon, German infantry had forced crossings at 3 points along the perimeter. Lord Gort, commanding the BEEF, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the beaches. He still believed evacuation might be possible. He did not yet know that the harbour was gone, that the small boats had never arrived, that the Royal Navy destroyers brave enough to approach the coast were being sunk faster than they could load troops. What began as an organized retreat became something else entirely as units lost contact with headquarters, as officers fell, as the roads clogged with vehicles that could go no further. The German armour, finally unleashed after days of frustrating inactivity, drove wedges through the retreating columns. Surrender came piecemeal at first, a company here, a battalion there, and then in a cascading collapse as men realized there was nowhere left to go. The beaches offered no salvation, only exposure to strafing runs. The town offered no shelter, only burning buildings and advancing enemy troops. By June 1st, it was over. Over 280,000 British and French soldiers passed into German captivity in the largest surrender of British arms since Yorktown. Gort himself was captured attempting to organize a last stand near Bray Dunes. The channel ports that might have sustained resistance, Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, all flew German flags. The consequences of this catastrophe would prove almost incomprehensible. But first, London had to learn what had happened. The news reached Downing Street in fragments throughout June 2nd, each report worse than the last. Churchill had built his political survival on promises of deliverance. He had told the House of Commons that the army would be saved. He had assured the War Cabinet that Dynamo would succeed. Now he faced the wreckage of those assurances, and across the cabinet table sat a man who had warned against precisely this outcome. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, had argued since late May for exploring peace terms through Italian intermediaries. Mussolini had not yet entered the war. A negotiated settlement, Halifax believed, might preserve the empire and spare Britain the horrors of invasion and occupation. Churchill had overruled him, insisting that Britain would fight on regardless of circumstances. But those circumstances had changed catastrophically. The conservative backbenchers who had reluctantly accepted Churchill's leadership now questioned whether that acceptance had been wise. He was, after all, the man who had championed the Norwegian campaign that brought down Chamberlain. He was the man who had promised the army would return from France. The party had never fully trusted him. Some had never forgiven Gallipoli. And now, with the professional army gone and invasion seemingly imminent, his position depended entirely on his ability to project confidence in final victory. Halifax presented his case with devastating precision. Britain stood alone. France was crumbling. The United States remained bound by neutrality legislation. What exactly was the strategy for winning this war? The cabinet session lasted 6 hours. No vote was taken, but the fracture lines had become visible to everyone present. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Without British divisions to anchor the western end of the Somme line, General Maxime Weygand's defensive strategy collapsed almost immediately. The French had been counting on the BEF to hold the Channel flank while they consolidated positions along the river. That flank now belonged to the Germans. Weygand attempted to redeploy forces to cover the gap, but redeployment takes time, and time was the one resource the Wehrmacht refused to grant. German armor crossed the Somme on June 5th against positions that existed only on planning maps. The breakthrough was total. Panzer divisions that might have faced stubborn resistance instead found open roads and scattered French units attempting to establish lines that were already outflanked. Paris, which the French government had vowed to defend street by street, was declared an open city on June 11th. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées on June 12th, 3 days earlier than in the timeline we know. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aged hero of Verdun, assumed leadership of the French government on June 15th. His first act was to request armistice terms. The fighting in France effectively ended on June 16th, creating a situation that seemed almost providential to those in Berlin watching events unfold. For the first time since September 1939, Germany faced no active military opposition in Western Europe. The continent from the Pyrenees to the Vistula lay under Axis control or Axis influence. Only Britain remained, and Britain, it appeared, had lost its sword. The island that had not faced serious invasion threat since Napoleon now contemplated the arrival of German troops within weeks. Britain's home defence forces consisted primarily of the newly formed local defence volunteers, men too old or too young for regular service, equipped with whatever weapons could be scrounged from museums, hunting lodges, and private collections. Some units drilled with pikes. Others carried shotguns. The handful of regular army divisions that had remained in Britain were under strength and poorly equipped, their heavy weapons having been sent to France where they now belonged to the enemy. Coastal towns from Kent to Norfolk began evacuating civilians. Church bells were silenced, reserved as invasion warnings. Road signs came down to confuse enemy parachutists. The population braced for an assault that military planners privately admitted could not be stopped at the beaches. Yet Hitler hesitated. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion plan his staff had been developing, faced significant obstacles. The Kriegsmarine had suffered heavy losses during the Norwegian campaign and could not guarantee control of the Channel crossing. The Luftwaffe, despite its triumph at Dunkirk, would need weeks to establish the air superiority necessary for amphibious operations, and there remained the possibility, the hope, in Hitler's calculation, that Britain might accept terms without requiring invasion. Churchill continued to broadcast defiance from London. But Halifax, operating through Swedish diplomatic channels, had begun quiet conversations about what an acceptable peace might look like. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced constraints that made meaningful intervention nearly impossible. The Neutrality Acts, passed by isolationist Congresses throughout the 1930s, prohibited the sale of arms to belligerent nations on credit. Cash and carry provisions had allowed some assistance to flow to Britain and France, but that assistance required both payment and transport, and Britain's dollar reserves were finite. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, stationed in London, cabled Washington repeatedly that the British cause was hopeless and that American resources should not be squandered on a defeated nation. Roosevelt himself believed that Nazi domination of Europe threatened American interests fundamentally. But Roosevelt was also running for an unprecedented third term against Wendell Willkie, and the American public had no appetite for foreign wars. Isolationist rallies organized by the America First Committee drew record crowds. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, argued that Britain's defeat was inevitable and that America should prepare to deal with a German-dominated Europe rather than waste lives trying to prevent it. Lend-Lease proposals that might have sustained British resistance stalled in congressional committees. Without the image of a defiant Britain fighting on alone, without the miracle of Dunkirk demonstrating that escape and resistance remained possible, the political case for American aid collapsed. Britain appeared not as a brave ally deserving support, but as a failing enterprise into which further investment would be foolish. The November election approached. Roosevelt calculated and waited and offered nothing that might transform the strategic situation. The second vote of confidence came in late July, and this time Churchill lost. His coalition had depended on the promise of eventual victory, or at least the credible possibility of victory. By midsummer, that possibility had evaporated. The RAF was losing the attrition battle over southern England, not catastrophically but steadily, and everyone who examined the numbers understood where the trend lines led. The Royal Navy remained powerful, but naval power alone could not win a war against a continent, and America had made clear that no arsenal of democracy would be opening for British account. Halifax became Prime Minister on August 3, 1940. King George VI, who had privately supported Churchill, accepted the change with the constitutional neutrality his position required. The negotiations that Halifax had been conducting unofficially now became official. Germany's terms were harsh but not maximal. Britain would retain its empire and its fleet, recognize German hegemony in continental Europe, and withdraw from active belligerency. There would be no occupation. There would be no puppet government. Britain would simply stop fighting. The armistice was signed on August 14, 1940. Churchill departed London for his country estate, his political career apparently finished, his warnings about Nazi Germany vindicated, but his remedies rejected. The war in Western Europe was over. Germany had achieved what Napoleon never managed, the defeat of Britain without invasion, the neutralization of the island kingdom through the destruction of its expeditionary capability and the exhaustion of its political will. Adolf Hitler now commanded a strategic position unprecedented in modern European history. With Britain neutralized and no prospect of American intervention, the two-front war that German planners had feared since 1914 would not materialize. Hitler could turn his full attention eastward toward the Soviet Union without concern that operations there might be complicated by attacks from the West. Operation Barbarossa, when it came, would proceed without the diversion of resources to Atlantic defense, without the bombing campaigns that disrupted German industry, without the psychological burden of an unconquered enemy at Germany's back. Japan, watching from Tokyo, drew its own conclusions. British withdrawal from active belligerency transformed the strategic calculus in Asia. The European colonial empires, Dutch, French, British, now lacked metropolitan support for their defense. The southern resource areas that Japan's military planners had long coveted suddenly appeared available for the taking. American opposition remained a concern, but America had demonstrated that it would not fight to preserve European interests. Why would it fight to preserve Asian ones? The war that eventually came to the Pacific would unfold on different terms, with different alliances against different strategic backgrounds. America would face a Europe closed to intervention and an Asia dominated by Japanese expansion, fighting alone or nearly alone against enemies who had years to consolidate their positions. History turns on small hinges. A storm in the North Sea. Aircraft grounded for a single day. Boats that never reached a beach. The men who made decisions in that terrible summer of 1940 did not know they were choosing between futures. They knew only that the present had become intolerable and that some path forward had to be found. In our timeline, the path led through years of war to eventual victory. In this one, it led somewhere else entirely, to a world we can imagine but were spared from living.